Pleasure and honor to welcome you to our fourth Presidential Science Advisor Evening on Policy, Politics and Science in the White House. Tonight we are honored to welcome Dr. Lane, the Presidential Science Advisor to Bill Clinton from 1998 to 2001. Dr. Lane will be introduced by Roger Pielke, Jr. just after my brief welcome. The kudos for organizing this exciting lecture go to Roger Pielke, Jr., the Director of the CIRRUS Center for Science and Technology Policy Research, and his staff. Some of you probably noted that I used the attribute Junior when I introduced Roger Pielke. Well, there is a reason. It's not his height. It's not his age. We are actually very fortunate to add Roger Pielke, Sr. to our CIRRUS and PEOS research and teaching faculty in the very near future. Therefore, Roger, I'm sorry, I think you got stuck with the attribute Junior. Or let me suggest an alternate way to differentiate between these two distinguished, eminent scientists, the Pielkes. Maybe PP and CP, Policy Pielke and Climate Pielke. Well, it doesn't really sound very exciting. But I actually just heard prior to this lecture that Roger Pielke Sr. requests that his email will be Senior SR. So maybe we have to change your email. The Center for Science and Technology Policy Research was initiated in 2001 by our former director and now interim provost Susan Avery in promoting science in service to society. It's Roger's continuing efforts and his accomplishments that just after 5 years made this center a well-recognized center not only at CU but in the US and abroad. Science and policy problems are not bounded by any discipline, but on the contrary, they should bridge across the physical, societal, and biological sciences. In CIRRUS, we have a long tradition in basic and applied research in the physical science, and more recently also in biological sciences. With the addition of the center in 2001, we added a third leg that addresses the relationship between societal needs and science and technology policy. Today's topic in our Presidential Science Advisor Series, as it has been in the 3 previous ones, is on policy, politics, and science in the White House. I know very little about policy. I know even less about politics. I know a little bit about science. How does science and the White House mix? Question mark. Dr. Lane will address some of these issues tonight. How science is used and has sometimes been misused in presidential decision making. I'm looking forward, Dr. Lane, for your presentation and for the following discussion. Junior, it's your turn.
I want to join Coney in welcoming Neil Lane here to CIRRUS, to University of Colorado. An event like this, again, as those of you who come to our other events, doesn't take place without the support of a number of institutions and people, and I'd just like to thank them. Major support has been provided by CIRRUS, of which Coney is the director, here at CU. We also acknowledge the support of the Graduate School, the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research, the Provost's Office, the College of Engineering and Applied Science, the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Fund for Excellence. And from beyond CU, we really appreciate the support of Southwest Research Institute, the Colorado School of Mines, and Boulder-based ICAT managers. They all make this possible. Several individuals I'd like to thank, Bobby Klein, who's the Managing Director of the CIRRUS Policy Center, and Amy Neku-Schmidt. Both have been instrumental in making things work as well as they have. I'd like to call your attention to our website. It's a content-rich website. You can find a lot of background readings on science, science policy. You can find video, streaming video of all of the previous Science Advisor visits, transcripts also. There's also a video of the recently retired Chief of Staff from the House Science Committee, Bob Palmer. He gave a talk last spring on partisanship and science policy. So now to the main event. There are 3 parts to tonight's festivities. First, Dr. Lane will give some remarks that he's prepared for this occasion. The second part will be an interview taking place here. I'll ask Dr. Lane some questions. And then we're going to turn it over to the audience and let you ask Dr. Lane questions that will be on your mind. So let me introduce Dr. Lane. Dr. Lane is a former provost at Rice University, where his tenure began in 1966 when he joined the Department of Physics as an assistant professor. He left Rice from 1984 to 1986 to serve as chancellor of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. So Dr. Lane has some Colorado roots. In addition, while on leave from Rice from 1979 to 1980, he worked for the National Science Foundation as the director of the Division of Physics. He became director of the National Science Foundation, the entire agency, in 1993. Widely recognized as a scientist and educator, Dr. Lane has written or co-authored more than 90 scientific papers and publications, including a textbook on quantum physics. He earned his 3 degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the University of Oklahoma, and is an Oklahoma native. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lane.
I'm delighted to be here. This is a very special part of the world for me. Colorado is one of my homes. As you heard, I spent a good bit of time at UCCS. I spent quite a lot of time in Boulder, and I started here in 1965, I guess, a visiting fellow to Gilla. And in fact, the couple who were the welcoming committee for my wife and myself were Jan and Lindy Hall. And most exciting event yesterday for many of us, at least certainly me, was the announcement that Jan Hall won the Nobel Prize this year. And so making 4 for the University of Colorado, 3 for Gilla. Taught him everything he knows. Now, Jan Hall's a guy that I think, while I talked to him a lot while I was here, I don't think I ever told him anything he didn't already know. So I couldn't be more pleased. It's just tremendously exciting. I chose a title for this group of talks, and I put up a picture of science advisors, just so you know that I know I'm supposed to talk about science advice. And here's some who's speaking to your series, and I put their names down here for some of them. And I want to be sure that you recognize Alan Bromley, who sadly cannot be with you for this series because Alan died too early in life just this last year, right after giving a lecture. In fact, Alan was a terrific individual, about whom I'll say more later. This photo at the top up here has a cluster or a covey, whatever you like, of science advisors. And the guy in the middle is Guy Stever, who was science advisor to Gerald Ford. After Nixon, you remember, fired Ed David, and you heard his stories. And there's a young Ed David right over on the right-hand side. I think Don Horning is standing right next to Guy Stever. So we want to try to go through who all those people are. But there have been a bunch of science advisors serving both Democratic and Republican presidents, and you're hearing from a number of them. So the title I'm going to choose tonight, it's a pretty subtle message, Threats to the Future of U.S. Science Technology. I've given a similar talk, but this will be a much shorter version of it on other occasions, because I'm very concerned about the future of science technology, and so I want to share with you what my concerns are and say a little bit about what science advisors can do about them. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm in a very short personal journey. What am I doing here? And second, how the White House works. Of course, I don't know, but I'll tell you what my observations are. And then I'll close with these I picked four threats to science and technology and what a science advisor can do about them. So first of all, the personal journey. It's all on one slide. So I start in Oklahoma, and that's much of my memory of Oklahoma. I love the weather. I love the storms. I was the last kid in the storm cellar. It got me fascinated with science, and my physics went a different direction. I'm on the UCAR board now, and I get to hang out with NCAR and with Roger and people who really understand atmospheric and weather science. It's a lot of fun. Then I went to Colorado, Gilla, and there's where I really experienced my first, 80-mile-an-hour wind. I mean, the shuck came down, blew all my boxes away, and so forth. So it's a different kind of a storm. And then I went to Rice, where the kinds of storms we have there, because we just had Katrina, tragedy, and Rita, not quite such a great tragedy, but a terrible storm. And then I went to Washington, National Science Foundation. Bill Clinton asked me to do that. I didn't know Bill Clinton. I was delighted to to do it, though, after serving a long time as provost, and so very happy to be involved. And, of course, I'd spent my time at UCCS along the way, and then finally the White House. In Washington, what I found was the storms were of a very different nature. The storms were human-caused kind of storms. You know, occasionally snow comes down, but the things that really shake that town are caused by human beings. And I'll tell you stories about some of those things. How the White House works. Well, you know, I really don't know how the White House works, and sometimes the White House does not work very well. And please keep in mind, I was only there 2.5 years. You know, it seems like longer, but 2.5 years. So Jack Givens served this wonderful period as presidential science advisor to Bill Clinton for 6 years. It was an extraordinary tenure. He was a wonderful mentor to me, great supporter of everything I was trying to do over at the National Science Foundation, and an extraordinarily strong and effective science advisor in my view. He had the respect of the president, vice president. He built a team of staff that I inherited in the White House, and I couldn't have asked for better support or for better people. But the White House is a kind of strange sort of place, and I had not any clue when I was at NSF how the White House actually functioned, because things I thought ought to be done, in fact, they were obvious that they should be done, and I would simply propose them and they didn't get done. So my view was there's something wrong in the White House. Now, I was very supportive of President Clinton. I believed in what he was trying to do. So when I explained what we needed in NSF, how come I didn't get the money? Well, when I got to the White House, I understood the situation a little bit better and had to cope with the same sort of problems and balances and judgments and decisions that Jack Givens had to cope with when he was in the White House before. Now, so what goes on over there? Well, let me sort of explain it the following way. I will just give you some impressions. I'll just make some points about my observations. So the first one would be that the principal focus of everybody in the White House is the Oval Office and the President. The President's agenda, the President's priorities. If you're there for anything else, people know it right away, and you might as well get out, because they're not going to let you do anything, and you're not actually serving the nation in that. So that's number one. You can never forget that in that job. If you get to a point where for some reason you can't support the President, you need to move on, do something else. Presidents can ask hard questions. President asks, how much do we want to spend on nanotechnology? My answer to that was, with respect, Mr. President, we need to spend $500 million. And he didn't just say yes, okay? But he thought carefully about it, and we ultimately got the nanotechnology initiative out of that. So second, with this sort of consistent focus with the President, is the day-to-day activities of the White House. Well, I'll put them in three categories. The day-to-day activities are urgent. So those are crises, they're disasters, they're wars, they're missteps, they're scandals. There's a bad story in the press that you got to deal with. Things that everybody focuses on in real time. Or perhaps the other category is strategic things. So these have to do with making sure you're advancing on the President's agenda, you're delivering on the President's campaign promise, you're working on whatever legislation you're trying to get off the Hill, and you're worrying about foreign policy, international relations, and so forth, and other strategic issues. And the third category would be routine. So the President's giving speeches. The President every week is going to give a radio address. This press advisor every day is going to answer questions for the press, and you need to be a part of that. You need to be preparing the press secretary, at least in your area of science technology, for that event. And then there's the message of the day, the communication staff, the regular meetings and all that. So that's the routine. That's what goes on. Third thing about the White House is it's a team effort. And there are some difficult personalities in that team. You can't get anything done. So sure, a science advisor could go into the President and say, Mr. President, we ought to do X. And Mr. President says, absolutely, Neil, you're absolutely right. I feel strongly about that issue, and leave. And then another presidential aide comes in and says, don't pay attention to him. He's just Neil. You know, he just cares about science. So you got to make sure that if you care enough about an issue that you want the President to pay attention to, you got to have a lot of support. You've also got to be there for them. They've got issues that they think are important. They may be education, they may be health, they may be crime, they may be anything. Wherever your office can be helpful, you need to do that. That was probably the thing that most described what we tried to do in the last 2 years. Make sure that our office was there for every other part of the White House to help them do their job in any way possible. And when I told my staff, when we tell them we're going to give them something, they got to get it what we told them we'd give them, and they got to get it when we told them we'd give it. If it's an hour late, it's too late. And it actually is too late. Whatever memo that is, whatever was written, whatever's going on is gone. It's done. So if you're able to do that, you establish an enormous amount of trust and rapport. And it doesn't mean everybody is going to support you in your work with the president, but it often means they will. And without that, then it just isn't going to work. This was some briefing in the Red Room. I don't remember what it was about, nano or something. It's the usual kind of interaction with the president. You get about 5 minutes for this sort of thing. He's getting ready to go make remarks. I'm briefing him. I'm telling him something which I didn't need to probably because he's a very quick read, quick study. That's a speechwriter in the middle, Lowell Weiss, about 16 years old. Extraordinarily gifted young man, wonderful. That's John Podesta, and I get the impression from John's face that I've exceeded my 5 minutes. That's my impression. Fourth on my points is the science advisor, of course, often speaks for the president on matters of science and technology. And that means you need to know what it is the president thinks so that you say the right things. It also means you have to support the president in his policies, whatever those policies are. And you have to do that while preserving your integrity as a scientist and the integrity of your office. If the president says something that's just wrong scientifically, then you got to figure out how to explain to the American people what the president really meant to say in such a way that everybody is okay. So that's part of the job as well. Now, the last thing you need to do in that office is work with all the federal agencies around government, and so you have a role in that. So let me look at that issue this way. Here's part of the executive branch of government. So the president is the boss. My staff made this, so they put the science advisor right at the center of all government. So the president has a bunch of offices and senior aides that advise him in national security, on financial issues, the budget, science and technology, environmental issues, economic, domestic policy, and so forth. They're in all these offices. He also is the boss of all these cabinet-level agencies, departments, of course, and each one of them headed by a secretary, Energy, Defense, Interior. Inside those are a lot of agencies. I'm sorry about the acronyms. Some of you will know them, and some of you won't. But we'll just pick Commerce because NOAA is a big deal in town, and NIST is a big deal in town. So is the NSF, but the Nobel Prize I mentioned, of course, is another Nobel Prize to NIST's credit, as well as University of Colorado. So those are two agencies embedded inside the Department of Commerce. Sometimes it's good to be covered by a cabinet-level department, and sometimes it's not so good. In this particular case, my view is not good. So here's a policy issue that we could talk about at some point. In addition to the cabinet-level departments that are headed by presidential appointees, usually very political folks, there are a bunch of independent agencies. Some of them are regulatory. Some of them are things like the National Science Foundation. It's independent in the sense it's not part of a cabinet agency. And while the president appoints the head of these agencies, and they are confirmed by the Senate, as are the cabinet secretaries, it's anticipated that these people are chosen because they have some kind of expertise. They have a slight clue of what the agency is actually supposed to be doing when they take the job. That's the idea. And of course, a regulatory agency, you don't want the White House manipulating regulation. Regulation is supposed to be interpretation of the law, and that should not be politically motivated. So, okay, so that's what that looks like. Now, what you find in this system, which the Founding Fathers put together, not exactly as we see it today, but this was their idea. Government's all spread out. It'd be impossible to run this operation. Yes, the president's the boss, but you can't run the government. And therefore, democracy can function in this way because we, the people, can come into this government organization in a whole lot of different ways. And this is only part of government. So we got the Congress, which I won't say a lot about this evening unless I get carried away or I get a question of that kind. So one thing you find here is science and technology are everywhere. So science and technology are in almost all of these agencies. Many of them actually support research and development activities in universities, national labs, and so on. Many of them also use science and technology for whatever their mission is, maybe agriculture, environmental protection, energy, defense, whatever that might be. One job of the science advisor is to coordinate those activities, and here's a list of science and technology related activities, just the ones that came up or that we were working on in the time I was in the White House, 2.5 years. And don't read all this stuff. I just put yellow so you can see they're across the map. I mean, they're food safety. They have to do with space, health, information technology, environment, energy. And we, in fact, put together a National Nanotechnology Initiative during the time I was there. Science advisor is supposed to coordinate those kind of activities across all of government, all the federal agencies, get everybody to work together like a happy family somehow, you know. So, and yet the science advisor has no clout. Science advisor is a staff member in the White House. The only reason any agency head would pay any attention to the science advisor is if A, they believe the president supports the science advisor, and vice versa, and the science advisor is speaking for the president. Then when you invite people to come and meet, they usually come. It doesn't mean they always do what you'd like to do, but they do come and you have a chance to do that. So that's one of the jobs. You have to do the same thing inside the White House. So suppose an issue comes up, food safety or something like that, happened to be one where my office had the lead. So if your office has the lead, it's just so obvious science and technology should be taking the lead here to make sure the job gets done. Then you call people in from the Economic Council, all these offices in the White House, and you call the deputies in from all the relevant agencies. If it's food safety, it would be agriculture and health and human services, because FDA inspects some of our food, and agriculture supports other of our food. Eggs, if the egg is whole, as I recall, it is FDA. If the egg is broken, it's agriculture. Think about pizzas, cheese, meat. So if you think we've got a real policy problem on food safety, you're absolutely right. So we worked on that. But the way you work on trying to improve policy, you've got to bring these people together and convince them that they're going to have to give a little, because any change means fewer staff here and more staff here, and the budgets change and so on. That's also a job, at least for some issues, for the President's science advisor. But you're doing all this with all this yellow stuff. This is our democracy. You know, it's a good thing. It's how we find our way in this maze. We do it through consumer advocacy groups. We do it on our own by just walking into these offices. If you're in the National Science Foundation, the chemists, the physicists, the astronomers, and God knows who else come in and explain how they're not getting enough money. Your government, and you really must hear from all these people. But sometimes the din of all this makes it very difficult to actually make progress. But it is our democracy. It's a good thing, and so I certainly support this way of doing business. But on a given day, you never really quite know what's going to happen in the White House. Okay, so what I want to do now is go to this issue of 4 threats of science and technology and what a science advisor can do. Here are my 4 threats. Let me say by way of preface that while all of these in my view are current in that they're important right now, I'm not just suggesting that this administration is somehow a problem in all these areas and we were doing just fine before. That's not the case. Many of these threats have evolved over quite a long period of time in Republican and Democratic administrations, and then some of them are more current, and I'll talk about which ones are. Before I do that, let me say 2 things I think about science and technology. These are just assertions. First of all, I'd simply assert science and technology is vital to the national interest. When you think of all the ways it connects with everything that's important to people, it impacts in a positive way the lives of everybody. And people know that. If you take surveys of the American people, it's different in other countries, but in this country, the American people are very supportive of science. They don't know anything about it. I mean, people are very open about the fact they don't feel they understand science very well, and they'd like to know more, but they believe that funding research, even if you don't know where the research is going, is a good thing for the federal government to do, and they believe that by a very large margin. Second assertion would be that science and politics are intertwined. I mean, like it or not, they really are intertwined. Maybe more so now than in the past, but it does happen. the current debate over embryonic stem cells, for example, therapeutic cloning, global climate change, intelligent design, reproductive medicine, and there are other examples, are examples where science and politics are mixed up, and sometimes in very unhelpful ways. And Neil may even have been a part of some of these unhelpful ways. We'll get a chance to talk about that. So each of these assertions is debatable, but just take it for a minute that I'm going to use that as a basis for what I'm suggesting are problems. So first of all, money. You need the money to support the research. Most areas of research, experimental research, is very expensive. And some areas of theoretical research now very expensive because of computational demands in order to go to the next step. So it's going to cost money. In my view, the federal government for a long time has failed to adequately support research. And the balance is wrong. So it's a combination, in my view, of the total investment and of how the funding is put forward. And so I'll illustrate that with this little picture. Okay? Here's what the U.S. spends in a year, right? Slide's a little old. It's based on the President's request for 2004 budget. The President requested $2.2 trillion and change in 2004. I compare that with what the President requested this year, 2 years later, 2006. He requested $2.6 trillion. I mean, that's a lot of money, and it's going up fast. Okay, so how do we spend that money? Most of it is kind of off the table. It's these things with X's in it. It's called non-discretionary. And non-discretionary are things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other mandatory different retirement funds. We've got to pay the interest on the national debt. National debt is growing. National debt, as I speak, is $7.9 trillion. Interest on that is $400, I calculated exactly, but $300-400 billion a year. We have to pay it. A lot of that debt is being bought by Japan and China, some of it by ourselves, some of it by other parts of the federal government. So we've got to do all that. Now, you could change the Social Security law. You could change Medicaid. But you don't just do that through the annual appropriation process. I mean, you've got to work harder if you're going to do that. I don't see those things getting smaller. If they're going to do anything, I see them getting larger, at least in the near term. So what have we got to work with? What is it the Congress fights over in the appropriations every year? It's this 1/3 of the budget that's called discretionary, and half of that is defense. That's half of that is defense. The wedges are research and development. Well, it's a sizable amount of money. Defense Department will spend roughly $75 billion on research and development activities, but there's not a lot of science in that. That's mainly development, large weapons development, ships, airplanes, missile defense, and stuff like that. And there is research in there, but it's mostly big development. The wedge down here in what's called domestic discretionary is all the rest of science and technology. And that's much smaller now, $57 billion. During the time I was in the White House, these were about the same, defense and non-defense. So what's grown is defense R&D, and it's mainly D. So most of the research is down here. So my point is given the tax cut situation, the state of the economy, some things that are off budget, like much of the Iraq war, expanding defense budgets, and other such matters, discretionary spending is going to get squeezed, and science is going to get squeezed within it. Now, to show that I speak truly, here's a graph that shows on the black curve discretionary, non-defense discretionary spending since 1962 in constant dollars. And so here we are up here where the red curve stops. That's about 2006. Well, that's where it peaks out. So the President of the United States must tell Congress every year what he's going to do the next 5 years. Here's what I plan to request from you for the next 5 years. Every president does that every year. So that black curve is what the President says he's going to do. He's going to cut the dickens out of discretionary spending for reasons I think we all understand. The red curve, and the scale for the black curve is on the left in billions of dollars. The red curve is non-defense R&D. And because it's non-defense, it's mainly research, basic and applied research. What Jack Marburger often emphasizes correctly is that the red curve tracks the black curve very well. When the nation is spending a lot of money and discretionary money, science does quite well. When it isn't, science is not doing well. And the only real strong exception was the Apollo project. That was mainly not research, that was mainly development, but it was non-defense, depending on how you view the Apollo project, okay? So, but after that, that went away, and then after that, you just track discretionary spending. So I think if discretionary spending is going to go down, which I believe it is, well, at least the president says it is, science is going to go down. My worry is that it could go down more, that it need not necessarily track. I think it will. I think it will track. But I have great concerns that connect with some of these other threats. And so now I'll speed up. People to do science, that's my second threat. Well, this is one we all know a lot about. There's school teachers here probably. Some of us are working in the K-12 classroom. Some of us are trying to hire people for our companies. We know there's a problem in finding talented scientists and engineers. And in this country for a very long time, we've not grown our own. We've not been able to adequately reach young people, young girls and boys in the schools and young men and women as they're growing up and coax them into careers in science and engineering in sufficiently large numbers to meet the need. Fortunately, we were attractive to people from all over the world. So young men and women came from all over the world to study here, and some of them to stay and work here and to fill jobs that were desperately needed. I think had that not happened, science technology in this country would be a very, very different situation. Well, this chart is only to remind you that a very large percentage, 40, 50% of our enrollment in 2001, not too many years ago, students born in other parts of the world in natural science and engineering. Those numbers are going down. We're less attractive to the rest of the world than we once were. The visa problem is part of it. Export controls, which we can talk about later if you want to, that's part of it, I think. Just sort of the overall image of America is maybe part of it. We don't see a way to replace those young people with our own young people because so far we've been totally unsuccessful in doing that. So I'm worried about that. Meantime, the rest of the world is doing quite well, thank you. So this is a PhD chart, and it only goes to 2001 because the National Science Board data only went out that far. But the Asian curve of PhDs in natural science and engineering was going up steeply. And that's mainly China and Japan. And China is the most rapidly growing one. So people are doing quite well at home. There are opportunities at home. There are opportunities in other parts of the world. And young people will go there. I'm worried what that means about the future of science in this country. My third threat is public understanding. I've suggested the public don't know much about science. Well, let's see. What do they know? Plants produce oxygen. 70% is pretty good. Continents have been moving for millions of years. Light travels faster than sound. I did this for Jan Hall. Okay. Earth goes around the sun. Well, that's good. But if you ask how long it takes, you lose 20% of the American people. So only 50% know that it takes a year to go around the sun. That's the same number of people that think the dinosaurs and the humans live together. Now, it's kind of it sounds like I'm making fun. I'm not going to make fun of the American people. I mean, this problem is our problem. And we really need to do something about it. It has a lot to do with K-12 education. But the American people, in spite of not knowing science terribly well, they do believe things that sometimes don't have strong scientific foundations. So what do people believe? Well, psychic or spiritual healing, over half the American people. ESP, some haunted houses. I won't take a vote, but 40% of the people believe in haunted houses, ghosts. You know, I don't like stormy nights and dark houses with the lights off and I don't know who's there. So I can kind of understand emotionally how people might respond to these surveys. Astrology. But it's the last one, seriously, that scares me the most right now. It happens to be a very hot topic. For 60% of the people, when this survey was taken, and it hadn't changed much through the years, but this survey is about 4 years old now, I would guess, because it's in the 2002 indicators. Over 60% of the people believe you should teach creationism in the schools, either with or without evolution. And actually, 16% believe you shouldn't teach evolution at all. It's a very important issue. We as a science community have not the slightest clue how to cope with this issue. We're doing a very bad job. Respect for the integrity of science. This is one that Roger touched on just a little bit. I think some of you know that several of us a couple years ago signed a statement criticizing the administration for misrepresentation of science, so-called a pattern of abuse of science. This is kind of a new thing because presidents over the years, including President G.W. Bush, has made statements about the integrity of science, how important it is that policy be established based on sound science. And I put a quote up here from President Bush's father, President Bush 41. Clinton has said similar sorts of things. But something has changed, because certainly in the time I was in Washington, and the time I can remember, when Alan Bromley was in Washington, when Ed David was in Washington, I don't remember anything like the kind of incidents that we complained about. And they tended to be in climate change, they tended to be in reproductive medicine, they tended to be in areas where the science was saying things that certain special interest groups that were very important to this administration didn't like. And so you found the government actually misrepresenting what the science was about. We thought that's actually dangerous in some areas, such as reproductive health, for example. So we spoke out on it. It probably was not at all smart politically to do. Jack Marburger even commented when he had to defend the administration on this, which he certainly did have to do, and he and I remained quite cordial through the process. Not that he would have preferred that we not do that, but I think we decided once the situation gets sufficiently serious, you just have to speak out. You can't just simply worry about the fact that people are going to be mad at you, but people really were quite mad at us over this sort of thing. So that's what I'm very worried about, because if science should become something that can be used for political purposes, if scientific knowledge doesn't continue to have some special credibility to it, doesn't answer all questions, but there is something special about scientific knowledge, at least we believe that. If you lose that, then I think this American support of science that I talked about could go away very fast. So I'm very concerned about that. Any of these is a problem. Many of these issues have been around a long time. The reason I'm so concerned now is we got all four of them, I think. They're all kind of down or no progress. That's what those arrows mean. And we're in a post-9/11 world where people are nervous. There's a great deal of uncertainty, with a lot of economic problems, a lot of problems all around the world. And when people are scared, in times of chaos, very difficult to get attention to these kind of long-range issues of education and science and so forth. I'm worried about that, and so that's why I'm raising them. Since this is the year of physics, did you all know this is the year of physics? The physicists named it. It's a year of physics because the 100th anniversary of Einstein's famous papers in 1905, where he laid out not all, but many of his most extraordinary discoveries. And he published his thesis the same year. I mean, it was a busy year, and he had a full-time job in the patent office and a wife at home and so forth. So a very impressive guy. But because it's a year of physics, I use two quotes from Einstein just to make 2 points. Einstein had some advice for scientists, and he had a lot of advice, but this one, concern for man and his fate must always form the chief interest of all technical endeavors, in order that the creations of our minds should be a blessing, not a curse to mankind. Never forget this. He said that in 1931, obviously a time of great turmoil in Europe and many parts of the world. The second quote I use is one I also think is very important, and it's a message for all of us, where he says everything that's really great and inspiring is created by the individual who can labor in freedom. He said that in a commencement address at Swarthmore in 1938, and then it was published, of course, later in a book. This is a picture of him becoming a citizen, which I call a real patriot act. These messages, both of them, I think, especially in a time that we're living in right now, where the truth and the value of science is being questioned in ways that to me are quite disturbing, suggest to me that scientists and technical professions of all kinds really need to get much more involved with the public and with the political process. I believed that for a long time, but I couldn't believe it any more than I do now. We need to help the public understand why science is special and what the risks are as well as the benefits. We need to do that in a candid and open way. And maybe even more important than that, we need the public to know that we care what's on their minds. We need to know what the public is thinking about. That's going to help us enormously in communicating with the public in the future. This is kind of a concept I've called the civic scientist, where a scientist uses his or her skills, knowledge, fame, education, and science and engineering technology to reach out to the general public, maybe in the classroom, or maybe in the church, the community groups, or maybe go to Washington or the House maybe actually get elected to office. I hope some of you will do that. I will vote for you. Well, I think. We'll talk. But I think. There are many civic scientists in this country. I use three here who are no longer living because we lost Ellen Bromley, and it spans U.S. history. So we start with Benjamin Franklin, great scientist, wrote beautifully also about electricity, became famous really as a scientist, and that helped him get the money we needed from the French. Thank you very much for that money, Eldon. And that way we were able to throw out the British. I'm sorry to my British colleagues. Get rid of King George and so forth. So here's a civic scientist who gave up his scientific career to form a new nation. First of all, to try to repair relationships between the colonies and England. That didn't work. So then, when he saw that failed, to try to get the resources necessary to have a successful revolution. Albert Einstein, that's a different case. Albert Einstein probably would have made a terrible policy person, even though he was offered the presidency of Israel, you probably know. Fortunately declined it. But he used his fame to open doors, to reach in the White House and be sure that Roosevelt understood that with atomic energy, which is part of Einstein's legacy, the equal MC squared formula, make sure Roosevelt understood that you could make a bomb, a highly destructive bomb, and Hitler might be doing it. Well, that led to the Manhattan Project. We built the bombs, we dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we killed over 200,000 people. Einstein certainly regretted that outcome, especially when he was convinced Hitler did not have a bomb, and I think that is certainly the case. Ellen Bromley, I use Alan as an example of a contemporary. Alan was a great scientist. He was a great science advisor, gave a lot of his time to public policy, and did it quite generously. So those are my examples of civic scientists. There are many civic scientists in this room. So my message to the young scientists, I'm at the end, is, of course, science is very challenging. It's very hard. It takes enormous commitment, focus, time, energy. And it's a wonderful calling. And I hope everybody who wants to be a scientist gets to be a scientist. All I would ask is that sometime in your career, sometime when you're inclined, sometime when you, especially if you feel you have the skills, you take a little time out to do some of these other things. Deal with some of these broader issues that touch on public opinion, on the education of kids in the classroom, on the health and safety and the welfare of all the people in the country and in the world, and maybe get elected to public office. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, so let's start the interview part. And I think we're going to have to trade back and forth with this microphone. So can you just tell us briefly how you went from NSF to being science advisor? Did Bill Clinton call you up, or what was the process? How did that occur?
Well, I think, I don't actually remember precisely, but I think it was probably Jack Gibbons that called me and said, would I meet with the vice president? And, I mean, the answer to that question is yes. You understand? You get a question, will you meet with the vice president? Because he'd like to talk to you about being science advisor to President Clinton. So I went over and met with the vice president, did a quick read of his book in case he asked me questions. I hadn't read it, unfortunately, before. And we had an interview, and at the end of the interview I said, well, Mr. Vice President, how'd I do? And he said, nobody ever asked me that question before. And I said, well, you autograph this book for my mother, because in case I don't get this job, this is my last chance to get the autograph. So I got the job. That's how I went over.
Can you discuss a little bit your relationship with President Clinton and how your relationship both as science advisor and personally compared with other of the top staff in the White House Executive Office of the President?
Well, I think I had a very good relationship with President Clinton. Presidents are busy people. So that's why I on purpose showed that slide, just to give you a sense of the pace of the White House. Anybody watch West Wing? Well, that's how it is. Anybody see the science advisor in West Wing? Well, that segment is coming up, I think. I complained about it. I mean, I saw Josh at some dinner in Washington one year. I forgot who the actor's name is, but he plays Josh, and I said, look, there's no science on this show. It's a great show. My wife loves what you're doing. I don't have time to watch you, but she says it's a great show, but you need some more science. And so it wasn't very long before they lost some poor guy in the space station up there. And I said, that's not what I had in mind. I mean, that's But that show is extremely realistic. And so that's my point. The pace of the White House is pretty much as it's on the show. The sets are not right. The officers are not that nice. You don't have the glass planes. You can't see through what everybody is doing. The White House mess is smaller and all that. But Oval Office always looks the same in all the movies. But the point about that is that it is a pretty realistic situation. So the president's very busy. So you catch the president on the fly. I mean, I didn't go in to the president and have 15 minutes every week to tell him what was on my mind. And so who would do that? So that's sort of the other part of your question. He certainly would see his chief of staff every day, several times a day. That was John Podesta when I was in the White House. He would see his national security advisor probably every day, once a day, talk to him several times a day. He would see his political advisors frequently. They're really the inner circle. They came off the campaign. They're old buddies. They play hearts together. You know, and that's their focus. Their focus is this president will succeed. This president will succeed. You know, if something's going wrong, we will figure out how to fix it. So you know how Karl Rove thinks? Well, that's how these people. No, that's not correct. They do not think like Karl Rove. But the one thing they do in common with Karl Rove is they're totally focused on the president's political agenda and his legacy. So those people see him frequently. And so then it's back to my point about what's important in the White House. It's things that are urgent, it's things that are strategic politically, and it's things that are routine. And so usually science is going to be routine. So what would be routine? I'd see the president sometimes once a week. Sometimes I wouldn't see him for 3 weeks. It just depends on what's going on. If he's got an interview coming up, if he's got a speech coming up that has something to do with science technology, if there's something in his State of the Union address on science technology, any of those kind of things, he'll call me in, and I'll go in and I'll brief him on it. Sometimes that briefing's on Air Force One, sometimes it's in the Oval Office, sometimes it's in the Red Room like this one was, and there were a lot of those. And even though they're short and they're brief, he's very smart. He reads everything. I sent him weekly reports. He read them all. He'd write in the margins. He'd send questions back. He'd send little memos. There's a lot of that communication. And so you get to know a president over that time. So I think he liked the job I was doing. I certainly loved working with him. And remember the timing, and no way you would know. I arrived in December of '98, just before impeachment. I went to my first State of the Union address after impeachment and when the Senate was taking up the trial. Remember, many people on the Hill didn't even think you should give a State of the Union address. So Neil was going around the halls hawking science while the Senate was getting ready to decide whether to throw the president out of office or not. I mean, this was kind of a tough sell. So it had to be very clear that to the extent Neil's selling science, Neil is selling the science and technology issues that are important to the president. Nothing to do with impeachment, but just his agenda. So I would see him a lot. And all during that period, he was totally focused on when I saw him, he was totally focused on the job he was doing. Came in the staff meeting one morning, said, I'm sorry my personal problems are making your job a lot more difficult. But the American people sent me here to do a job. I'm going to do that every minute of every day, and I'm asking you all to do your job as well, which of course we all did. So business was absolutely uninterrupted all during that extremely horrible, if not excruciating period. I liked the president. We would sometimes have small talk about black holes and things like that because you're intellectually very curious. But usually the focus was on the kinds of things that were particularly important to his agenda.
Well, on that note, can you give us an example of a time when the president came to you with a substantive issue or a substantive question that asked your office to weigh in on?
Yeah, I think one of the larger issues, I think, was missile defense. But that was more a formal process. It was anticipated that I would give the president advice on missile defense. The president had promised the Congress he'd make a decision on whether to deploy a system or not. And when he was in the process of making that decision, I, with a lot of advice on my staff and a lot of classified briefings, prepared a memo for to provide him my own advice on just the technical capability of the system. I'm not there to advise him on other aspects of whether national security interests or political consideration, anything else. My job is to tell him whether the system is technically correct. And it's a classified memo. I can't tell you what it says. what I can tell you is I was very happy when he decided he wasn't going to deploy a system. A second one's a little bit different. It's sort of more an anecdote. We were on Air Force One flying to California, and he was going to give a speech on science and technology and roll out his nanotechnology initiative and the rest of his budget for science and technology, which was wonderful in fiscal year 2001. He was proposing almost double the largest dollar increase the National Science Foundation had ever gotten, and that was not all nanotechnology. So he's going to give a speech. Well, you saw the speechwriter. Wonderful guy, but it's always an excruciating event working with these speechwriters. They know what they want the president to say, and you know what you want the president to say. I'd been trying to get something in that speech for weeks. Couldn't get it in. It always get taken out by the speechwriter, who always has the last word. However, on Air Force One, the president comes in and says, Neil, what do you think of this speech? Ah, it's a great speech, Mr. President. Really like it. Caltech audience is going to love it, which they did. The president said, anything in the speech that you don't think ought to be here, or anything that you think ought to be here that isn't? And I said, well, now that you ask, Mr. President, there is something I think you would want to say. And I told him what it was, and he said, absolutely, I want to say that. And he said, any idea where to put it in the speech? And I said, yeah, page 4, paragraph 6. So he opens it up, he scribbles it in. And the point was, he's talking to a Caltech audience of primarily scientists. And at some point in the speech, he says sort of something like I said, that we've been very fortunate in this country over the years. We've been able to attract to America some of the brightest and the best young men and women born in countries all over the world. And they've contributed enormously to the progress of this nation in science, technology, and many other ways. And that got him the only applause, except for the end in the speech. But he deeply believed in those kinds of issues, and it should have been in the speech at the very beginning.
Well, I guess the converse question is, were there cases, policy issues that the administration dealt with that you really thought your office should have been consulted on or consulted more thoroughly on that it wasn't?
There were a lot of them when I was at NSF that I should have been consulted on, that I think the White House should have done differently. They generally had to do with money and how the money was passed to me. Some years my whole budget increase was for climate change. That's ridiculous. I'm for climate change. We need to do more global change research, but not your whole increment. So there were things like that. But that was not, and that wasn't, I think, Jack Gibbons doing either. Science advisor can only do so much. There were a couple of things that Jack maybe, I don't know what Jack talked about in that particular issue, if he had the same question. But I do remember that prior to my going to the White House, there was a stem cell decision that I think the science advisor was consulted on, and the president made a decision that was different than the one I would have advised him to make had I been there. But I don't know what Jack's advice was. And there was also an issue of needle exchange. And the science is pretty clear on needle exchange if you want to cut down on HIV. But the president didn't go for federal funding for needle exchange. So I know that was an issue that Harold Varmus often talked about. And so there are these issues where the president makes policy decisions. But I don't know of a single case where, certainly where I, as science advisor, was not consulted where I thought I was. There was a budget meeting I was not invited to that I thought I should be invited to, but that wasn't the president's decision. That was a member of another of the presidential aides who sets the agenda for the budget meeting. And if Neil comes, it's going to cost money. So I didn't get invited. So I heard about the meeting. I went anyway. And I got there early, and there was a young staffer putting out the name cards. And I said, I just don't see my name tag. My name card. Well, who are you? Well, I'm Neil Lane. I'm president. How do you spell it? I put it up there. I sat down, and then everybody started coming in. Once people start coming in and the president starts coming in, nobody's going to throw you out of the room. I mean, create a very important meeting. That was a meeting the president asked a lot of questions about the nanotechnology initiative. So you need, in that White House, yeah, you need to be a part of a team. You need collegiality and trust, but you need assertiveness. If you don't, from time to time, make a decision to push over the edge, even if you get slapped back, then you're really not doing your job. I did that a couple times. I have a few scars and bruises, but fortunately, none from the president.
In our discussions and in our research preparing for this series, we sense there's sort of an image of a golden age of during the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, where scientists were very close to the president, very close to the seat of power. That all obviously came crashing down when President Nixon decided to kick the scientists out of the White House. But what's your sense, taking the long view, of the evolution of the role of science advisor, its ups and downs, and where it is, I guess, today and since your tenure?
Well, this is a hard, much debated question, and I don't have any special wisdom on this or anything else my wife would tell me. But my best guess on this is just a simple answer. After the war, first of all, science really proved itself in the war. I mean, that's what grew the science budget. Vannevar Bush pointed out to President Truman, because President Roosevelt had died, that the science that won the war could win the peace, and the federal government should make an investment. A lot of it should be in the universities, and that launched the NSF, and much of the rest of the rather elaborate now science technology system that you see. The early days of the Cold War were still very nuclear kind of issues, and so physicists were the science advisors by and large, and they were close because you were designing new weapons, you were designing new missiles, you were pushing those things. So yes, in some sense it was a golden age, in quotes, of science advisors, but it was all about war. And then it was all about Cold War. The latter stages of the Cold War, things thawed out a bit. For some reason, we didn't blow each other up. I don't know why we didn't, but I'm glad we didn't. Things eased off, and the focus got more diffuse. Science technology then, it was clear, was impacting all kinds of things: health, economic development, environmental protection, and energy, and so forth. So there wasn't such a clean single focus. They still tended to bring physicists in for some reason, but the issues weren't quite so urgent as they were during wartime. Now we're in the post 9/11 era, and Jack Marburger, for reasons we all understand and probably would agree with, has focused his attention, his office attention, on the agenda right now, which has a lot to do with terrorism, has a lot to do today now with Katrina and natural disasters. And you have to be agile, you have to do that. Will something replace the Cold War as a reason, as a way to focus again science and technology and bump the budget up so this dismal curve that I showed is no longer, doesn't apply? I don't know the answer to that. I don't see what it is right now. People have been searching for a long time. The latest buzzword, it's not latest, it's an old buzzword, is innovation. It's CEOs of major corporations, not all of them, but many of them in this country, realizing that to have innovation, they've got to have that infusion of technology and bright people that they're not seeing in such large numbers anymore. They're worried, they're starting to speak out. And I would say even in this budget cycle, we were getting some traction on that issue until Katrina. And that pretty well took the wind out of all of us. So we still need to work together to focus on that. But because of the diffuseness now of science and technology, I would say the science advisor is less immediately connected and sometimes less valued by the president and the people around the president. And I even found when I went to the White House, and Jack Gibbons told me this was going to be the case, you're really going to have to prove quickly your value in the White House. And a lot of different ways to do that, but you somehow got to make it clear that the president's agenda is your agenda, and that your office, it's got 60 people in it, has got something to offer to the president's agenda. And we work very hard on that.
Before we talk about the current administration in a little bit more depth, I'd like to get your views on the different perspectives you get being director of NSF and the science advisor to the president. Those are probably two of the most influential science policy positions in the country, and you were in both. What's the view look like from the different positions?
Well, I mean, I love the NSF job, and I, let's say, liked the White House job. I didn't want to leave NSF. I committed to serve a term when I came. The NSF director has a 6-year term, and most directors did not serve a full term. And Vice President asked me when I first came, and I had my first interview with him before NSF, if I'd serve a term, and I said I would. And I kind of wanted to serve the term. But I understood Jack Gibbons wanted to move on and certainly deserved to be able to step down. And when asked by the president to be science advisor, unless you got a really good reason. I mean, he was my boss. I had to say yes. And I was flattered and feel very privileged to do the job, so don't get me wrong about that. But the NSF job, you're the CEO of a very well-regarded agency. And the agency has a lot of money. In those days, it had, I don't know, $3.5 billion, got $5.5 now. You don't go in with the thought you're going to change a lot and you're going to move a lot of that money around, but the agency as a whole does a lot every year and can do a lot, so you really feel good about that. And you're the CEO. In the White House, you're a staff member. But you're a staff member for the president. So the two jobs are totally different. When you're the CEO of NSF, you have quite a lot of power. And if you use it properly, that means respecting the people who work for you and the people in the community who you work for, in a sense, you can actually get a lot of good things done in a short period of time if you can get along with the Congress. And in the White House, your power is the president's power. You speak for the president, but your job is really to cajole, to persuade people to work together, bend a little, give a little, to get something done. So it's a very different kind of job. And then you also have to figure out how to be a part of the team. And a lot of those people came off the campaign. If you weren't in the campaign, you're starting way back in terms of credibility in the organization. Because if you've done a campaign, which I never have, you know what it's like. I mean, you become brothers and sisters. I mean, blood relations to the core. You know everything about one another, and you've learned how to get along, or if not, you're no longer together. That gets translated into the White House at the beginning of the term, first term. Sometimes not translated terribly well for the country because that's not a campaign any longer. That's a very responsible job in charge of the executive branch of government. So that job is quite different. I liked both jobs. I learned a lot from both jobs. I got scars and bruises in both jobs of a different kind and feel enormously privileged in a very patriotic way, actually, about serving the country in that way. I wouldn't have traded that for anything short of the Nobel Prize.
All right, so I guess I'll give you an open-ended question to amplify some of your remarks in the prepared comments. What is your view of the current state of science advice in the Bush administration?
Well, I'm not a fan of G.W. Bush, okay? I didn't support him, didn't vote for him, don't think he does a good job. I am a fan of Jack Marburger, and I complimented, I mean, President Bush didn't ask my opinion, but when the press did, I complimented President Bush on his appointment of Jack Marburger. I thought it was an outstanding appointment. Jack had all the background, knowledge, skills, abilities, personal skills to do the job. Everything he's done well in his career, as far as I know, including his last job as director of the Brookhaven Lab, when the lab was in major trouble. And I think Jack has tried to do the very best job he can. As far as I know, he is doing the very best job he can. And I'm not aware anybody else could do a better job. But it's a very difficult time and administration to be trying to do that job in. So as you know, right after 9/11, the White House moved his whole office out of the White House complex, down the street. Not far, half a block. Now they're a little closer. But they're outside the White House complex. If you're outside that fence, you are outside. You might as well be on the other side of the country because that's a security fence. So if you're inside, either the Dwight David Eisenhower Executive Office Building, you remember that great gray hulk that sits next to the White House. If you're in that building or literally in the West Wing of the White House, you're only a few minutes away from one another, any one another. Your staff moves all around. In a day, they see dozens of other staffers in all these offices. You do also. You can get to the president if he needs you in 4 minutes, faster actually, if he really says so. And so that's access that you can't trade for anything. And it's not Jack's fault. I'd have been moved out too after 9/11. 17th Street's very close to the edge of that building. Cars, trucks go up and down 17th Street. They moved everybody out of that wing of the executive office building. But Jack was unable to move back in. It's not his fault. But it's a problem. It's his problem. So his office does not have that kind of access. Also, his title, he wasn't given the title assistant to the president, which is kind of a slap in the face, and it's a signal to all the other senior aides that the science advisor is less important. Whether it's true or not, I'm not saying it's true, but it signals that. And so it's another problem with access. And the other thing then is this administration has really shown no sign of having science as a terribly high priority, or engineering or technology for that matter. So all those things together make it just a very difficult time and situation in which to be a science advisor. But I've always supported Jack Marburger. I'm glad he's doing the job he's doing. I'm not sure what would happen if he were to leave.
You mentioned that you signed the statement, I guess it was last year, criticizing the Bush administration's role in scientific integrity. But then soon after the election, you were one of, I think it's fair to say, very few people adopted a more conciliatory tone, saying now's the time for the scientific community to reach out to the administration. And you were quoted in Nature as saying that, I think it was last February. So now that we're a few months on from that, do you still feel that the scientific community should be reaching out? And what does that exactly mean for scientists and leaders of the scientific community?
Well, I think I did say that, and I did sign the statement. I signed it because I thought the situation was sufficiently outrageous, to pick another word, that somebody had to call attention to it. Obviously, it didn't have to be me. I mean, most of the people that signed that were well-known figures, Nobel laureates. So the list is kind of Nobel laureates and Neil, if you want to look and see what the list is. The reason we signed the statement is because the administration, for whatever reason, had put false information up on the website of the National Cancer Institute about alleged relationship between breast cancer and abortion, because they were pushed by conservative groups to do it, so they did it. They put false information up, or took correct information, valuable health information, off of one of the health websites on the effectiveness of condoms in preventing disease, and replaced it with abstinence-only information that was highly misleading. They doctored, I would say, in a way that went well beyond any kind of editing we would have suggested in government reports. The State Department report first, and then an Environmental Protection Agency report on climate change, by essentially changing enough words so that it was totally misleading in what the science was all about. They muzzled a scientist in the Department of Agriculture and wouldn't let him publish his work because he found a connection between pesticides, I guess, and the potential for antibiotic resistance in human beings living in the area, something like that. So health effects of agriculture practices that some agricultural company didn't like. So it was just becoming very clear that there were some lobbies whose voices were being heard and things were being done that we considered abuse of science. It's not that policy decisions were made that we disagreed with, where many considerations apply. Stem cells, we didn't complain about stem cell decision because nobody was misrepresenting the science. The president made a decision. Some of us liked it, maybe some of us didn't like it, but that's not the same as the government misrepresenting or falsifying what the scientific record really is. That's what we were complaining about. So why did I say reach out after all of that? Well, you can't give up. I didn't expect that we'd all be welcomed into the offices of the people that we just slammed. And we never said, and never believe, I certainly don't, that the president directed all of these things to happen, or there was some conspiracy in which these high-level officials all got together and said, hey, let's falsify science to please our... It just happened. As Jack Marburger himself said when he was defending the administration, sometimes people do dumb things. Well, these were a lot of dumb things. And so we thought it was a very bad situation. But I felt, and I feel still, that with turnovers in agencies, new people come to town, new political appointees, let's have a conversation about this issue. Let's see, okay, do you think we really misrepresented what your agency did under a previous director? Or give us some advice on what's a better way for us to try to call these things to the attention. Would it have worked better if we'd gone to the Secretary of Health and Human Services and said, why did you do this, Mr. Secretary? Because in some cases it was Mr. Secretary or the second level political appointees. So it's just time to talk about those kind of issues, because you can't win this. I mean, this can't be a continuing battle somehow between science and administration. It's a larger set of issues. It's not about one president even. It's not about one set of political appointees. Some of these things reflect changes that have been occurring over the whole country. And they reflect, I don't know, values, beliefs of a large fraction of the American people. Maybe not the majority, but a lot of people, and what they think is important and what they're willing to tolerate. So I'm worried about it at a much larger level than one administration. And I think whoever the next administration is, science community needs to show that whatever some of us might have signed that irritated people, as a community, we really recognize the reason we're funded by science is for the benefit of humanity. The things we do in our laboratories, the things we do in our classrooms, the things that use federal money are supposed to be for the American people. In order for that to happen, our voice and policy has to be heard, and we have to be supportive of the political process. And so I think, again, we need a dialogue here. I believe that then, I believe it now. There have been some meetings. The more effective ones probably are the more private ones, because there's such a hot topic politically that I think it's not good to publicize the meetings themselves.
Well, before we turn it over to the audience, there's two topics that are of particular interest to the Boulder community I thought I'd give you a chance to reflect on. One is, what's your thoughts on the current approach to space policy, human space flight and its effects on space science in particular?
Well, I co-authored a paper on that not very long ago with George Abbey, who's a wonderful former director of the Johnson Space Center, and he actually knows a lot about space. So it was fun to write this paper with him. We wrote it for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it's on the U.S. civilian space program. And we made, I think, 4 points. Our first point was that export controls, especially as you must get licensed through the State Department, have really essentially killed the U.S. satellite industry. France has run away with it, but U.S. satellite industry has been deeply hurt by these export controls. See, if you want to sell anything, any kind of a space technology or instrument, something to do with space, to some other country, or you want to share it collaboratively with a fellow scientist in another country, and it's got to do with space technology, you've got to get a license, or you're in violation of the law. And that means you have to apply to the State Department, because space issues have been defined, space technology has been defined as munitions, same category as guns and rockets and stuff. Well, rockets, space, you sort of get it? Okay. So the trouble is, it's a very cumbersome process. It takes forever, and there's no assurance when you'll get a license. There's no assurance you will get a license. Well, people who want to buy things from us don't need that. You can buy equally, if not better, technology in other parts of the world. So we lost the market. Not only that, I don't think we would have been able to do the shuttle program, the space station, whether you think it's a good idea or not, under the current export regulations. The second, so we were simply drawing attention to a serious policy issue that's well known in policy circles, but has not gotten much attention in larger circles. Second issue we pointed to was, I think, what we called I don't remember the term we used, but it had to do with an incomplete vision for space science and human space flight in the future. And there we were commenting on President Bush's Moon-Mars plan. And what I had already said in testimony was what we said in the paper, that I believe President Bush's vision was a bold vision, but I felt it was incomplete. It was bold in that if you say you're going to go back to the moon and on to Mars, that's bold. That sort of has to be a presidential statement. You never do anything like that if it's not a presidential initiative. But it was incomplete in my view, because science was not included as one of the high priorities of NASA. And many of the gems of NASA's, are really the science. All those planetary missions, even the ongoing Mars robotic missions and so on, the Earth observation, satellite missions and so on. I mean, all that stuff was relegated to a lower priority by just simply not raising it. I thought that was very scary, very dangerous. And the other thing about the president's vision being incomplete is it wasn't funded. What was said about the future budgets was totally inadequate in my view to do anything like what they said they were going to do. a lot of things about phasing out the shuttle when they said they were going to do and so on that just didn't compute. Just not, careful thought had not gone into the plan. The president just gave the speech being handed something from NASA, and there wasn't a real plan there. To be fair, in parentheses, the new administrator, very accomplished and very knowledgeable person, is trying very hard to make sure that they do the president's vision, but at the same time they don't kill all the science. And so I'm hopeful, but he's not going to be able to do it without a lot more money. So we shall see. Meanwhile, science is getting killed every day, every year. Missions are being delayed, canceled. You may have read the big battle over the Hubble. Looks like they will make a mission back to repair the Hubble, but that was after a huge amount of noise from the astronomy community and Senator Mikulski. Huger amount of noise on the political front. So that's happening. Third thing we pointed to is a problem that, in my view, we have all over science technology in the country, and that's the manpower issue. I already talked about that. We just called attention to it in the case of space. I hear that from NASA. I hear it from the contractors. I hear it from the aerospace industry. They just cannot find the quality of people that they need. So that's a scary situation. The last one is really the most serious in my view, and it relates to the others, is the sort of deterioration of international cooperation in space. It's something to do with something of the negative image that our country has gotten for various reasons over the last several years. But when the president's Moon-Mars plan was rolled out, essentially saying we were going to back away from the space station, a very important international cooperative activity that many nations had invested in, we didn't consult them. We didn't even let them know we were going to make the speech, as far as I know. If you know differently, please tell me. But my checking is, with my colleagues in other parts of the world, is it was a total surprise. And when Sean O'Keefe gave his talk about what was going to happen, same day as the president made his speech, Sean made very clear this is going to be a U.S. mission, this is going to be a U.S. plan, U.S. program, and sort of if other nations want to be a part of it, we'd be glad to talk to them. It's not a really good way to start a partnership. And we can't do any of this without other nations. We can't do most of the large astronomy missions without other nations. We can't do a lot of the Earth observation without other nations. We just can't afford it. And in some cases, we don't have the technology. We need these other countries. So I think it's not prudent to offend them all when you're rolling out your new space mission. So I have other criticisms, but those are just four. Okay.
All right, and my last question for tonight is the same one, but what are your thoughts on climate science and climate policy and where we're at and how things have evolved since your term as science advisor?
Well, something's going on. Never saw weather like we've had recently and so forth. It's a really complicated issue. I mean, climate science is wonderful. It's really interesting. It's system science. It's highly nonlinear. It's very challenging kind of on every front. And so that's why I really enjoy, I don't know climate science, but I really enjoy learning about it. But my point is, it's really complicated. It has not answered all the questions, as you well know. So there are uncertainties. And in a situation, and we have lots more work to do. But because it's so important, has such important policy implications, the likely increase in the average temperature of the Earth by, I don't know, pick your number, but let's say 4, 5, 6 degrees Fahrenheit, in even as short a time as 50 years, but certainly 100 years, the likely increase in sea level, there's a range, but 20 inches would not be too surprising in a century. Those are big, big policy issues, and you need to get ready for them. But there's a lot of political sensitivity here. ExxonMobil is in my hometown. They haven't been really friendly toward climate science. So the climate science community has to be extraordinarily careful saying what it knows and what it doesn't know. And then I think, to be fair, the people on the policy side need to actually be receptive to those ideas and not falsify the information for the American public. And then we desperately need the people in between who really understand policy and who really understand climate science and help us get through these gaps. So I think global warming is clearly real. Climate change is real in some measurable ways. The predictions can only be done using very elaborate computer models, which are limited by the physics and chemistry of the models, although they're very sophisticated, ocean, atmosphere coupled models. And they're also limited by computing power. And finally, they're limited by not knowing what the world is going to do in the next 100 years. So the best you can do is to make assumptions about the population growth, which is pretty clear. A lot of these people are born. So we're going to go from 6 to 9.8 billion people by 2050, and then we're going to go to a little less certain, but 11 maybe by 2010, by 2100. So people use different numbers. Economic growth, you got to assume something, so assume 2.5% a year for that period. Reduction in energy intensity, you just take the historical assumption. Energy intensity, energy per economic growth has been going down a little bit. We've been a little more efficient as a world for the last 20 years or so. Use those same numbers. Assume carbon intensity reduction as a function of energy is going to keep going down, as it has been doing at, 0.2% a year. I'm not sure I got that number right. Put all those in the model and decide how much carbon you think we're going to pump in the atmosphere between now and 2050 and 2100. So that you have to have that also before your models can predict what the temperature is going to be and what sea level rise is going to be. So I'll stop with that. I've already told you a lot more about climate science than I know, except that it's complicated. It has enormous policy implications. And on this, I rather agree with Roger, although we haven't had a chance to discuss it on this trip. There are a lot of things we could be doing right now that we should be doing right now because we already have a problem. Katrina exhibited that in a horrible way for New Orleans. It was coming. You knew it was coming. You just didn't know when. We're built up all along the Gulf Coast. $1 million homes. I don't own 3 of them, or 1 for that matter, along the Gulf Coast. Next category 4 comes through Padre Island, anywhere along those barrier islands. It's all going to go. Government's going to pay a lot of money, your tax money, my tax money, people building along the rivers, heat controls in cities, building planning in cities, parking lots, buildings. Why don't you put green roofs on them? I mean, all that whole set of kind of friendly environmental issues that many of my colleagues call tree hugging. I mean, these all make sense. We know what all those technologies are. The science really is pretty good in a lot of that. There's terrible water problems coming up, droughts in this part of the country and other areas. We're going to have a lot of flooding. Climate change is probably going to make droughts worse. It's probably going to make flooding worse. In my view, it's probably going to make more high-intensity storms like Category 4 or 5 hurricanes. That may be wrong. It's a much less certain issue. But why not? We have those storms already. Why not, as a country, decide we're going to deal with some of these issues that are killing people right now as we speak? And then as we learn more about the science, we'll be much further along in protecting ourselves from whatever climate change is going to deliver.
All right. Thank you, Neil. All right. So the ground rules are the quick questions and quick responses. We'll get as many in as we can tonight. So let me just see a show of hands. And I need to repeat your question for the TV. So I'll go around the room. So why don't we start on this corner? So the question is to relate a few anecdotes from interactions testifying with Congress.
Clean ones, you mean? Yeah. Because Congress is kind of funny on a given day, and they say some things that I probably wouldn't share with you today. I did testify a lot before Congress. One positive one, one negative one. I testified before Senator McCain, actually, after leaving government, when I was still in government. McCain had come back off the campaign trail. He'd been asked by a lot of people his opinion of climate change. Senator McCain, isn't this a serious problem, climate change? He said, I don't know what it is. And so he promised young people that he would find out when he got back to Washington, because I guess by that point he knew he wasn't going to be president. So when he got back to Washington, he asked his staff, what is this all about? Staff told him. He got concerned. He set up a series of hearings. I was the first witness at the first hearing. I was a government witness. And it was a wonderful hearing. It was a balanced hearing. He had climate skeptics as well as people who believe strongly in the possible effects of climate change. I was simply testifying on behalf of the government's position, the Global Change Research Program, and our policies, Kyoto, and all the rest of those things. And McCain made a wonderfully strong and informed statement opening the hearing about climate change. And I looked around in there a little bit, and there was Senator Brownback from Kansas. I thought, oh my God. He's you probably know him. He's in Kansas, very, very conservative senator. And I thought, and why did he come? Well, you know, if Neil had been smarter, he'd have seen it. Senator Brownback is interested in emissions trading, in the fact that if you grow things, you might in fact bring to your state money, because when you're growing things, helps in the carbon scheme. U.S. gets credit for the things it grows, or it will when all those if we get back in negotiation again. So, you know, in the Kyoto Agreement, there was lots of things undecided, but in principle they were decided, that you would get credit for growing trees and green things, and you would be harmed when you cut them down or they burned down. You would be harmed when you emitted carbon from fossil fuel burning. You could buy credit by paying money to countries who could produce less emissions. So all that's built in the Kyoto Protocol. Senator Brownback was very nice, asked very thoughtful questions. He didn't make strong positive statements about climate change, but he at least didn't rake me over the coals. A not so positive one was early in my time when I was at NSF, and I came into a Senate appropriation hearing, and Senator Ted Stevens came. Republicans were in the minority that year, and Stevens, kind of a curmudgeon, Alaska, and has never liked the United States spending, National Science Foundation spending all that money in the Antarctic. NSF has a responsibility for all the science in the Antarctic. We don't fund all the science, but we have a responsibility for all the infrastructure, the airplanes that go in and out, everything that goes on down there for the U.S. And Senator Stevens, you know, seen one pole, seen them all. I mean, he's got a pole up there. And so why would you do research at the South Pole that you could do at the North Pole, and you could do the logistics out of Alaska? So he'd braked me over the coal a lot before, and so there he came in, and he really ran me through the ringer. He's got fishermen drowning off the coast of Alaska, and Neil Lane and NSF are doing search and rescue in the Antarctic where people don't even live. I mean, how do I explain that? I don't remember. I hope I had a good answer to that.
So the question is whether in Dr. Lane's tenure he ever received any communication from the scientific establishment, anything similar to what the Bush administration has received.
Was that your question? Okay. No, I think not. But I think the administration I was working for was, even though we were not very good with science budgets for the whole first term, because if you remember, President Clinton's campaign promise was to cut the deficit and balance the budget eventually. And so he just cut the ribbons out of a lot of federal spending, and he cut staff as well. So that was part of the frustration I'm talking about arriving at the NSF. But I think it was clear to everybody, I think, that the administration, maybe symbolically because Gore was there, I think people just knew that the White House cared about science and engineering, and that probably Jack Gibbons, Neil at NSF, Harold at NIH, of course Harold was rolling in money, but we were trying to support the research as best we could, and certainly the White House was very environmentally friendly. So there was no situation in which, that I'm aware of, where we were accused of misrepresenting the science or using the science somehow for political purposes. So I never did get a letter like that. When I was at NSF, I got a lot of irate phone calls about Nobel laureates who'd lost their grant funding, and some from Congress who discovered we were giving a grant, and there's not time for me to explain it, but it's an interesting story. And then another phone call from another congressman, and then finally a whole lot of congressmen calling me, wondering why in the world National Science Foundation funding a dirty tricks campaign to unseat members of Congress. So things like that happened. That was at NSF. Probably the most difficult call I got in the White House was after we had inadvertently crashed the biotech market in the NASDAQ in October. I wrote a statement, which really means my staff had helped me put it together, negotiated with Great Britain, explaining that we believe, our position was that the human genome, the raw sequencing information of the human genome, should not be patented. That should be made freely available to everybody. But it got muddled in the press release, and people who don't know a gene from a hole in the ground ran out, called the papers, and reported that the White House has decided genes will no longer be patentable. Everybody sold off. People lost billions of dollars that day, and the market never recovered, certainly during the time I was there. It first hit the biotech market, then it hit the whole NASDAQ, and then finally hit the whole tech market. That was the beginning of the slide. Neil did it. And when I walked into the staff meeting, and I had to brief the president immediately after this press conference, where I discovered for the first time this had happened. And I wasn't there when the press release got muddled. They hadn't called me down. I wish they had. I hope I wouldn't have misled them. But something got confused. And so the message with that, the reason I took the time to tell you that, is a little mistake in the White House can make a huge difference. And so you really must realize when you're in those jobs, you have enormous responsibility. And that's why the stress level is so high. Because even though you don't have a whole bunch of people in an agency you're responsible for, you do have a responsibility because a slight mistake can make a huge difference. You have to absolutely be sure, as you possibly can, that you're correct. What you're advising the president to do is correct. And the president, in this case, had signed with Tony Blair such a statement. So later I had to tell the president, after I briefed him on something else, by the way, Mr. President, there's this one other thing. We seem to have crashed the NASDAQ. And he was very reflective. He was very good about it. Next day he gave a speech to somebody and said, well, yesterday we crashed the NASDAQ. We didn't mean to, but we did it anyway. And when I went in the staff meeting the day after the crash, Gene Sperling, head of the Economic Council, said, before we start this meeting, I want to tell everybody that Neil managed to do in one press release what Alan Greenspan has been trying to do for 6 months. So, was that a compliment? I couldn't tell.
Why don't we take one more question, and I think we're due over here on the right-hand side. So the question has to do with asking Neil to address the role of science education as a possible solution to the 4 threats that he discussed in this talk. So,
well, I mean, yes and no, I guess. Absolutely, yes. I mean, you couldn't be more correct. This is fundamentally an issue of science education, but it's not just our young people and our not so young people understanding more about physics and biology and chemistry. There's that other more complicated level about what science has to do with all these other issues, which is more complicated and generally not taught very well. In fact, if it's taught at all, it's taught in an inverted way, as somebody pointed out to me recently. You sort of teach that part early, and the kids have forgotten it by the time they learn physics and chemistry, because the way in which science progresses, primarily, I guess, for reasons of mathematical preparation, but it doesn't work to deal with this kind of issue. So yes, definitely science education and education more broadly in the way I just described. It'll take a long time. We've been working at it. Wonderful people have been working at that for a very long time, including people in this room, and I know Nobel laureates who are working very hard on education. So scientists are paying attention. We do a lousy job in many universities. I don't know about this one. I love this university. I don't like to say anything at all that might be negative about it, but maybe you're not doing a great job either in integrating somehow the scientific part and scholarly part of the establishment with teacher education. At least we didn't do a great job when I was working in the system. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but and I think until that gets fixed, we're not going to make any progress on education. My view is the departments, you guys, the chemists, physics, astronomers, economics, true in the humanities and social science, going to have to take ownership of this problem somehow. Not just here, of course, all over the country. And that's hard. Well, what do you mean? How would you do that? I don't know. It's a very, very difficult issue. First of all, we're not welcome sometimes to the table because we're threatening or we don't know anything about the classroom, or we tend to come in with the wrong kind of approach. I'm not sure, but we need to work it. We need to figure out. If we're smart, we ought to be able to figure that out. Universities need to find ways to encourage that, and for God's sake, the National Science Foundation needs to figure out how to encourage that rather than put impediments that actually work in the other direction. So I think we really need to do that. But the no part of my answer was yes. Essentially, it was just your second point. You got to do some things in real time. So Congress wants to get reelected. They got to do something now. They got to do something this week. They got to do something in this speech, this campaign, and so on. And so we also have to be smart on that side and figure out what are the things we can ask our policymakers, our members of Congress, our people in the White House to do that are actually going to help, but will also help them. So we've got to put ourselves in their shoes. And I think the only way to do that is to get to know the political system. Some of us work in it, talk to the people who have worked in it. Brad Byerly over here is one of the world's experts. He's got bruises and scars. He knows how Congress works. And so do others in the room. Because you have to understand that culture and what their needs are so that when you go into their office, you say, I'm a scientist, Congressman, I'm here to help you. You really need to help them as opposed to just taking their time. That's a short-term part. And that has to do with education, everything else connected with science, technology, and policy. But I want to thank everybody who does contribute to education with kids and adults and everybody else in whatever way you do. And a lot of you do. Maybe everybody in this room is connected somehow with trying to improve the situation in education. Because at the core, that really is what the problem is. And that's how we resolve a lot of our problems, not just science and technology policy, but many of the others.
Dr. Lane has been exceedingly generous with his time, with our students, with our faculty these last 2 days, so with us tonight. So why don't you join me in thanking him for...